Law 529, General Relevancy, Section 9, Visual Identification, Lecture 3. Okay, in this lecture, we are going to focus on identification evidence. If we recall, Section 9 have 5 relevancy situations, and one of it is actually on identification evidence. In our previous lecture, we basically have discussed several forms of identification evidence, in which identification of a person can be determined either by photograph. We also have voice identification, DNA identification, identification by smell, fingerprint, as well as CCTV identification. Yeah, that was in our last lecture. We look at various forms of ways to identify an accused person or a person. Today, the focus of this lecture is actually to look at one aspect of identification, that is visual identification. Now, what is visual identification? Visual identification is where you have an eyewitness here perceive an accused person commits a crime, and he is giving evidence of that visual identification in the court. So he may give description as to the person that commit the crime. The idea of him giving evidence of visual identification is actually to put the accused at the scene of the crime as the person who committed the actus reus and the mens rea. You have to bear in mind that since we are relying on an eyewitness visual identification, there is very high possibility of some prejudicial aspect of it, because the nature of being human is that, number one, you may have some memory issues, right? So if a crime has been committed like 2 or 3 months ago, you may have some memory impact, in the sense that you will not going to be able to recall the face of that person, right? So you have that memory issues. And the other one here is where you have some psychological effect when you are giving evidence of visual identification. Now just imagine you are walking in a park, right? And suddenly you were approached by a man from your back, and he basically approached you, put a knife on your neck, and maybe he looked at your face and asking you your money or like your life. Now in this kind of situation here, which one are you looking at? Are you looking at the knife that he was holding, or are you looking at his face? Now in this kind of situation, what will happen here is that the psychological impact of this encounter may have some significant effect on whether you are actually seeing the knife or the face of the person. Whereas in the context of visual identification, you have to identify the face of the person, of the accused person, to be the one that actually caused you, that actually attacked you on that night. There's also some research in the aspect of visual identification, in the sense that you may have trouble identifying a person which is cross race, right? So if you're a Malay and you see maybe individuals of Indian descendants, they will basically look the same, or even Chinese descendant, they look the same, right? So this is a situation of cross race, and this prejudicial effect, this mistake happened in the situation in the US or in the UK, in which they have discovered this to be the problem in their Innocent Project. Now what will happen in this, one of the cases that was encountered by the Innocent Project is that you have an accused here which is an African American who was charged, convicted for sexual assault of 5 or so white women. And all these 5 white women identified the accused person, who was an African American, to be the person who assaulted them. Now these cases came to a decision without the benefit of DNA technology at that time. So what happened here is that by virtue of visual identification of all the 5 witnesses, the accused person was put in jail. I think he has been spending his time in jail for about 50 to 20 years. When the DNA technology came by and the evidence was again reconsidered and analyzed, and found that the accused person was not actually the person who sexually assaulted these 5 women. So this is a situation where you have visual identification can sometimes be very, very unreliable. It can be highly prejudicial in some cases, right? So if you can have some other form of evidence like DNA identification, that would be very good, yeah? Now when we talk about visual identification here, because of the nature of the identification through visual by an eyewitness here is highly prejudicial, normally there will be 2 issues involving visual identification. That is issues of procedure and quality. Now, so this will basically be the visual identification evidence, the issue of procedure, and the issue of quality. Now, we will look into this PowerPoint again, but I want to explain to you about visual identification in a more interactive way. Now, since we have now visual identification, so what happened here is that you have here an eyewitness, right? Eyewitness is giving evidence of identification, visual identification in the court. So the eyewitness here is going to put the accused person in the court. Now, as I told you just now, when you talk about visual identification, when you talk about issues of visual identification, there will normally be 2 issues, whether it is issues of procedure or whether it is issues of quality. Now, bear in mind that if you have visual identification, the case of Datuk Multah Hashim said that between recognition and identification, recognition can provide you with a better quality of identification evidence, right? Now, what does it mean by recognition? Recognition means that the person known, the accused person is known by the witness. So he recognized the person. So if you have a situation where you have here the witness here who is the victim is assaulted by an accused person who is known by him, now this witness here can give a better evidence of identification of the person who assaulted her, because of the issues of recognition, right? So according to the case of Datuk Multah Hashim here, recognition would be more reliable evidence of identification of a person compared to mere identification of a stranger, right? And by virtue of this one, what happened here is that you have the case of Kanan against State of Kerala, right? Where the court says that, you have to do an identification evidence. You have to do an identification evidence in the sense that, right, identification parade becomes mandatory. And also you look at the case of Arumugam against PP that says that subsequent identification in the court will be of little value if you do not have an identification parade. Now, so from these 3 cases which I have discussed with you, so we finally discovered that there are 2 processes that is so concerned of visual identification. That is one relating to the issues of procedure. We will look at what does it mean by issue of procedure. And the other one will be issues relating to the quality of identification. Now, bear in mind, the moment you have visual identification as your issue is either in your practice or in your questions, you've got to basically identify whether the issues that you are concerned here falls under the procedural issue or whether it should fall under the quality issue. Okay, now, so when we talk about the procedural issue, now let's look at it, So now you basically have visual identification. Of course, visual identification is evidence of identification under Section 9. Now, when you talk about the procedural issue on visual identification, what your concern is actually issues relating to identification parade, right? What your concern is basically issues of identification parade. Now, what is an identification parade? Identification parade is where you have a person, an accused person, being identified by a witness in a line-up. So what you have basically a line-up, right? So in the US, they call it identification line-up, but in the UK, they call it identification parade. So we here in Malaysia, we use both, yeah? You can use either identification parade or in a line-up. So the moment you have procedural issue here, you are basically concerned with identification parade. Now, why is this so? Because you remember you have a witness who may have seen a person commits a crime. Say you have Ali is in charge for the murder of Mona. This is you, Zach, who was doing your routine job at Taman Tasik Shah Alam. The murder happened at Taman Tasik Shah Alam, katakanlah at 7:15 p.m. while you were doing your routine job. And you saw this man, Ali, stab Mona. So you saw him stabbing, you saw the figure of a man here stabbing Mona twice, and then you shouted, "Hey, what you do?" And this man froze, he looked at your face for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then he ran. Yeah, you have the accused person here, ran away from the scene, and you basically go to the woman. The woman is actually lying, bleeding profusely. So you quickly call 999, and by the time the police came, she is dead. Right. Now the issue here, okay, she may say, prior to the death, Ali did. Right. So we have this kind of situation. So police conduct investigation. Right. Police conduct investigation. What will happen here is that Ali is now being interrogated by the police. You become the star witness of the prosecution. Now, what will happen here is that you will be giving evidence in the court. When you give evidence in the court, you will basically give evidence of visual identification. Why is it a visual identification? Because you actually saw Ali stab Mona. So, when you are giving evidence of visual identification, the court must be really sure that you actually saw Ali and not someone that looks like Ali. Okay, so it has to be Ali and really Ali that you saw, because your evidence has to put Ali at the scene of the crime. That's the idea. Now, what will happen here? During investigation, Zack here, right? Okay, police conduct investigation. Maybe after 2 days, the police will going to call Zack here to the police station, right? And he will have to identify the accused person in a line-up. Yeah, in a line-up. So you have to identify an accused person in a line-up. Okay? So this is where the procedural issue come into picture. You got that? Right? Remember, when you have this identification parade, which is identification by the witness here, PW, yeah, identification of the witness here, which is PW, in a line-up. So PW here will identify the accused person in a line-up. So this is a process known as the identification parade. Now, when is identification a procedural issue of identification parade come into picture? Who are you scrutinizing? Who has to be aware of the procedure? Now, when you talk about here, number one, so you have here Zack here being called to the police station to identify the accused person in a line-up. Now, the first issue that you have to ask, yeah, is when do you think there is a need for the police to conduct an identification parade? Okay, before that, bear in mind, yeah, the issues of identification parade will always happen at an investigation stage. Yeah, it will always happen at investigation stage, right? So this is a stage where the police is still gathering evidence, and one of the evidence that police have to gather is the identity of the accused person. So this happened during the investigation stage, and the process of identification parade will be conducted by the police at the police station, right? And this test is very important, because identification parade normally done for the purpose of preservation of the witness identification, credibility of the witness identification later in the court, right? You will find that the outcome of the identification parade, so if, for example, you have PW here, positively identify the accused person as the person who was at the scene of the crime, this evidence is going to be corroborative evidence of identification. Right, this evidence is going to be corroborative evidence of identification at a later stage. So now, the first issue will be, right, your first issue will be, when do you need to conduct an identification parade? Remember when we have the case of Datuk Mohtar Hashim just now, Datuk Mohtar Hashim says that recognition is much better than a mere identification. So when you have identification evidence here, when will be the time for you to conduct an identification parade? I think it's going to be very impractical for the police to do identification parade at every time when you have a case, right? So on this point, you got to look at the case of Sarjit Singh, whereby the case of Sarjit Singh, the court says that identification parade becomes necessary if the accused person is a stranger to the eyewitness. To the eyewitness. So you have an accused person here who is a stranger in the sense that the eyewitness either never see the accused person or could have seen him somewhere but he can't really recognize him. So that is a situation. That is what's stated by Sarjit Singh. And remember, as I told you earlier, the case of Kanan against State of Kerala says that you have to do an identification parade, need to be done. Because according to the Kanan against State of Kerala, failure for you to conduct an identification parade resulted in the subsequent identification be of little value, right? So that's why it becomes important. And of course, the case of Arumugam indicate that there is a need for you to have an identification parade because the case of Arumugam says that identification parade will help to enhance the credibility of the witness. Got the picture? So if you have a fact situation, you are looking at the police here, whether the police are doing their job properly or not, whether they do identification or not. So you got to look at the question, if the accused person is stranger to the police, if the accused person is stranger to the victim, right, then you have to conduct an identification parade. So that will be number 1. So that is when to conduct an identification parade. Okay, got that? So now, that's number 1. Now let's look at number 2. So you have just now, number 1, the when question. Now number 2 is the how question. Is the how question. How do you conduct an identification parade? The case of Duis Akim basically reflect to you as to how identification parade has to be conducted, right? When you talk about the how question, how is identification parade is conducted, you have to bear in mind that the ideal way to conduct an identification parade, maknanya this is the best way which protects the accused person. You have to remember at this stage, the accused person are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. So the ideal way, because of that, you cannot treat him so much like a criminal, right? So because of that, protection has to be afforded to the accused person. So in the conduct of identification parade, because I told you earlier that the nature of visual identification is highly prejudicial, protection on the accused person has to be preserved as well. So the ideal way in the conduct of identification parade is basically face to face, right? It means that you have the accused person here being lined up together with 9 other persons. If you have one accused person, you basically have 9 foils. Foils is referring to those who are lining up together with the accused person. Now, the accused person will face the witness face to face. So it has to be a face to face identification, right, in a line up. And what will happen here? Okay, this is where, you refer to the book, you can find the number of foils that can be lined up together if you have one accused person. What happens if you have 2 accused persons? in a lineup, so they basically need to have at least 13 to 15 people in the lineup. Yeah, so it depends on the facts of your case whether you have one accused person or two accused person in the lineup, and the number of falls will also depend on that. Yeah, you have that in the case of Dharma Raj, you can have that in the case of Chan Chung Kiong, and of course the case of Dus Aikin. So what will happen here is that when you have a face-to-face identification, so the accused person will be eye-to-eye, face-to-face with the victim. And the idea is that if the victim finds that, and now, okay, it is the option of the accused person, yeah, before the victim is called to identify him in a lineup, the accused person has a right to choose where to stand. So the accused person will be waiting at the side, the falls will be lined up, and the accused person, if he decided to stand beside the person number 3, he just go to that person and stand beside him. So basically this is a situation, yeah. So the accused person has a right to choose where to stand. And remember, when you have face identification parade, you cannot have the eyewitness looking at the accused person prior to the lineup being fully ready. So you cannot have view of the accused person as if he is a criminal, right? So if you have a face-to-face, so now everything is in order, it is in a lineup. You will have the victim here in front of the accused person. If the victim manage to identify the accused person dekat line number, katakan dekat number 3 just now, what he has to do is that he will say number 3, yeah, the witness will say number 3, and he has to go to the accused person and tap the shoulder to positively identify this to be the person who attacked me last time. So that is a face-to-face identification. That is how the ideal way is to be conducted. Now, what is the problem with the ideal way here? The problem with the ideal way of visual identification here is that you are not going to have any witness testifying in the court, because you will find that the witness here will not going to see the accused person face to face. He or she will be in fear. So as a result, she may not want to give evidence in the court at the end of the day. So because of that, because of the weaknesses ataupun the fear caused by this face-to-face identification or the ideal way of identification at the identification parade, they have developed a system to allow for the use of a one-way mirror. Yeah? Now, what is one-way mirror? One-way mirror is where you have a situation where the accused person is in the lineup. Yeah, the accused person is in the lineup, and the witness will be sitting at the other side of the mirror. Ya, kalau you macam tengok movie ke, cerita-cerita criminal ke, you will find that the accused person together with the false will have to face a mirror, and behind the mirror basically are the victims ataupun the witnesses who will identify the person through a one-way mirror. Yeah, so this is a one-way mirror. Now, one-way mirror is not the ideal way in the conduct of identification parade. Why is it not the ideal way? Because remember, you go back to the presumption. You have the accused person here sitting in the front of the mirror. He was not able to observe what transpired at the other side of the mirror. Dia tak boleh nampak. There can be situation, maybe, yeah, the witness here are discussing with one another. Maybe the police officer is coaching the witness, we do not know. So because of that, if you want to allow for a one-way mirror, there must be some kind of protection, right, on the accused person in the aspect of his rights. So what will happen here is that sometimes for this purpose, you may have CCTV to capture the image of what transpired at the other side of the mirror, right? You may also call the representative of the accused person to be there observing the process at the side of the mirror. So it can either be the representative, can either be the family member or the friend. Yeah, family member or the friend of the accused person. Now, if the accused person here call a lawyer, now this lawyer here will not going to be able to become lawyer for the accused person in the later part, because he will become prosecution witness. So he will give evidence for the prosecutor with regards to the process of identification evidence. Got the picture? Right, you may call your friend, you may call your family member, but you don't call your lawyer, because if you did that, your lawyer will become your witness now instead of becoming your lawyer. Okay? So this process of one-way mirror is allowed in Malaysia. You have that in the case of Law Ong Lai Kim. You also have that in the case of Ong Po Cheng. Yeah, so this case basically allow for the use of one-way mirror in Malaysia, and one-way mirror has been allowed the use even by the other Commonwealth country. Yeah, so alright, so this will be the case. Yeah, so the how question is by way of a one-way mirror. It has to be face to face, but it can also be through a one-way mirror. Now let's look at further. So you basically have number one just now, the when question. Number two, the how question. How question here is that how do you conduct an ID parade? So how do you conduct an ID parade? It has to be face to face. Nonetheless, they allow for a one-way mirror. Now, the third question that you have to ask is actually, what are the procedural safeguards? So what are the procedural safeguards, right, that the accused person or that the police must observe in the conduct of identification parade? You have to bear in mind that when you talk about identification parade, as I told you earlier, this happened at the investigation stage, and the one that have to observe the procedure will be the police. Right? It will be the police. So the police have to observe the procedure, so there must be some kind of procedural safeguard. Right? On this one, okay, I want you to just look at the books, because there are so many procedural safeguard that you have to observe. Number one, it has to be in a line-up. Right, you have cases to illustrate that. You cannot be alone. Yeah, you cannot be identified alone. Instead, it has to be in a line-up. The conduct of identification parade has to be as soon as possible. Yeah, the person who is in charge, that is the identification parade officer, must have no interest in the case, in the sense that, katakanlah the IO who investigate this case cannot be the identification parade officer. So basically, you have quite a number of procedures which you must read and observe, right? So these are the procedures that has to be complied with by the police in the conduct of identification parade. So whenever, one of the processes is that whenever you identify the accused person, whenever you do an identification parade, you have to make sure that the files that is lined up together with the accused person has to be of about similar age, about the same age, about the similar stature, about similar appearance, station in life. If you have an accused person here who is a teenage boy, about 18 years old, you cannot letak kola biru orang pakai, kemeja and blazer as one of the foils. It's totally out, yeah? Because there have been cases where they have that, yeah? You have that in the case of Chansing, you have that in Pasupati and whatnot, yeah? So there are quite a number of procedure on identification parade that you have to observe. This one, I want you to make your own research and identify the process, because in the question, right, you have to identify whether or not there is procedural issue or whether or not there's only quality issue. So if you have procedural issue, you are not supposed to just tell me the whole procedure. You have to pinpoint what is the procedure that is being breached and what is actually the proper procedure. So you cannot just give me ada 10 prosedur ni lah prosedurnya. You will not going to do that. You only pick up the one that is relevant to the question. Yeah. So that is how you go about it. Okay, now. So what will happen here is that, yeah, during identification parade, so you have here the foils and the accused person being lined up, right? So they are lining up, and you have the witness here that identify the accused person. Now, what could be the outcome of the identification parade? So number 4, what could be the outcome? So the outcome of the identification parade is basically like this. Now you have first outcome. So you have outcome. Number one, you have first outcome is that you have the witness here. I padam sikit yang ni. So it's going to be, I have more space to write on. Okay, the outcome here, number one, the witness failed to identify. So maknanya there were no positive identification at the identification parade. Yeah. One, no positive identification at the identification parade. Of course, eventually, the identification parade evidence cannot be tendered as evidence in the court because there were no identification made by the witness. So the identification at the identification parade is not relevant, not admissible, because there were no positive identification. Number two, there could be positive identification. Yeah, there could be positive identification by the witness, and the positive identification is also supported with proper procedure. Maknanya you have a situation here where the witness positively identified the accused person and the police has complied with proper procedure. Now what will happen here is that the identification evidence of the witness is relevant and admissible to be tendered as evidence in the court. Yeah, the identification evidence at the identification parade. You have to be very sure, be clear, because there will be another form of identification that we're going to look at. Yeah, so identification evidence at the identification parade of a witness is relevant and admissible or not. It was a positive identification. The procedure was proper. And the third one here is where you have positive identification. However, it was an improper procedure. Maknanya, you have a situation where the witness here identified positively of the accused person, but the police have failed to comply with some of the procedures in the conduct of identification parade. Now, what will happen in this case? Right? So, maknanya, there was a positive identification, improper or flawed procedure. Right? In this note, you may have two possible outcomes. Right? However, the two possible outcome here is as a result of you looking at it from the case of Tirumalai Kuma. So, the case that you have to bear in mind will be the case of Tirumalai Kuma. Also, the case of Dus Akim. Also, the case of Joachim, and the case of Pasupati. Whereby, if there is a positive identification but the procedure is flawed, these cases basically says to you that you got to look at the breach. Yeah, if the breach is fatal, then it goes to the roots of the identification. It becomes so highly prejudicial, then the identification at the identification parade will be rejected, not relevant, not admissible. You got that? So if the procedure is, the breach is too fatal, cannot be remedied, highly prejudicial, you got to reject it. But if the procedural breach is not fatal, yeah, it is not fatal, it can be remedied, it can be modified, then the identification at the identification parade therefore is relevant and admissible. So if it is relevant and admissible, then in this context, when the court consider the weight of the evidence, it can either be affecting the weight, maknanya resulted in it affecting the value of it, or it can also be worthless. So bear in mind. So if you have the relevancy, if the so meaning that if the flaw can be remedied, the flaw can be remedied, the identification at the identification parade may be relevant and admissible. However, it may affect the weight of the evidence of identification at the identification parade, and in some cases, it can also become worthless. right? Boleh tak jadi apa-apa value. Got the picture? So that is the situation, right? So that will be what you know, what you need to know about procedural identification. Yeah, procedural on identification, which is the identification parade. Now let's look at your notes again. Okay, will this be this one? Oh, not this one. Yeah, it should be this one. Yeah. Now, if you look at here, back to our earlier notes, remember when we talk about visual identification, there is issues of procedure, and this is what we have discussed just now. The what question, the how question, what is the procedural safeguard, and the implication. Now, we are going to look at the second issues relating to visual identification is actually issues of quality, right? The issues of quality of identification. Now, what will happen here? Now, let's look at new notes here. So now, remember you have visual identification. You basically have procedural issue. You undergo procedural issue. The identification parade has been conducted, and then you basically have the outcome, right? The outcome here, it may be a negative identification, no identification, therefore it is not relevant, not admissible. You may have positive identification, good procedure, so it will be relevant and admissible. You may have positive identification, other flawed procedure, other flawed procedure. So this one, you got to look at it whether it can be remedied or it is not remedied. If it is not remedied, so it is not relevant, not admissible, because the flaw is fatal. This is where the flaw is fatal, right? You cannot remedy it. So if the flaw can be remedied, then it may affect the weight. How much weight can that particular evidence of identification carry when you bring it as evidence in the court? Now, what happened here is that if this happens, you have procedural issue here. Now, you have a witness here who basically perceived the incident. He actually saw what transpired, especially if he is the victim, he will definitely have to give evidence in the court. So, there can be a situation where he may fail the identification at the identification parade, but he will have the second chance to identify the accused person again in the court. Yeah, he will have the chance to identify the person again in the court. So this is identification in the court, and this identification in the court, the moment the matter goes for trial, so this is where you have the trial, the matter goes to trial. When the matter goes to trial, you are now concerned with the quality issues of identification ataupun of visual identification. So your issue will be on the quality issues of visual identification. Now, when you talk about matters relating to what transpired during trial, right? You have to bear in mind that the person or the authorities that you are looking at will be the court. You are basically looking at the court to look at what will the court decide upon looking at the victim giving evidence of identification in the court, right? Now, you have to bear in mind that you have the very important case that you have to know, and please read, is the case of Dorai Pandian, right? The case of Dorai Pandian says that identification evidence at the identification parade is not conclusive. So, maknanya in the case of Dorai Pandian, ID evidence at the identification parade is not conclusive. Maknanya not so important, even though it may contribute on the quality assessment of the identification evidence, right? So, it is not conclusive in the sense that, because what is important here will be the identification in the court, right? The identification in the court will be much more important, because the identification in the court will be the substantive form of identification. It means that the outcome of an identification parade here, the outcome here is only amounting to corroborative evidence. What is corroborative evidence? It refers to as only supporting evidence. So it is not conclusive evidence. What is more important will be what transpired in the court. Why is this so? Why is the case of Dorai Pandian here says that the more important evidence of identification is when the witness here giving evidence in the court. Why? Because evidence given by an eyewitness in the court will be direct evidence as to what transpired. So it satisfies Section 60 of the Evidence Act. Remember, when you go to the court to give evidence of identification, right, you are recalling back to the day when you meet the accused person. So the accused person here will give evidence relating to the account of his meeting with the accused person. So he will be recalling that incident. So the kind of evidence is going to be direct evidence, right? And it will be the conclusive evidence of identification. The conclusive and substantive evidence of identification, right? So this is what happened. Now during trial, you call the witness to give evidence in the court. Basically what will happen here is that the prosecutor will ask the witness, do you actually saw the person who attacked you on that night? Then the witness will say yes. Can you pinpoint him in the court? And the witness will pinpoint the accused person on the dock. Now identification in the court is also known as dock identification. So you have this as dock identification, right? So this is a very, very important point of identification, right? So you have just now gained visual identification. You had the procedure just now. So you are looking at the trial. So when you look at the trial, as I told you just now, you are looking at the court. How will the court analyze? How will the court analyze the visual identification evidence of the witness? Because the witness here will undergo the process of examination in chief, cross, and re-examination to determine and to give evidence in the court of the fact that at that time he actually saw A, bukan orang yang nampak macam A. So that is what happened. So the court will evaluate the evidence of this particular witness as to what transpired in the court. Okay? Now, they must, because of this, because of the nature of identification of a witness here is highly prejudicial, the court has to be very cautious. So the court is now relying on a guideline to basically help the court in coming to a right decision in the assessment of the visual quality identification. So here, the judge is relying on, the Turnbull guideline. Now, the Turnbull guideline here comes from the case of R.N. Turnbull. So it comes from the common case of R.N. Turnbull, whereby this Turnbull guideline is basically guiding the judge as to how he should analyze the evidence of the eyewitness in coming to a conclusion whether the evidence is of good quality or poor quality. Now the Turnbull guideline here, of course, is a common law decision. Because of that, it has to be incorporated in Malaysia, and it has been approved in the case of Ja'far bin Ali. So Ja'far bin Ali actually has taken in the case has taken in Turnbull guideline as part of our law, but it has to be modified. Because what happened here is that the case of R.N. Turnbull was decided and the trial was by virtue of jury trial. However, in Malaysia, we do not have jury trial. Everything will be decided by the judge, being the arbiter of law and fact. Because of that, the Turnbull guideline has to be slightly modified. Now, what is the Turnbull guideline? Basically, there are 4 guidelines in Turnbull. Right, number 1. Right, there is a need for the judge. So, there is a need for the judge to warn the jury yeah, to warn the jury. So this is in the context of the common law in the case of RN Turnbull. So in Malaysia, we have to modify it. There is a need for the judge to warn himself as to the danger of identification evidence. Yeah, as to the danger of identification evidence. Now, bear in mind there is no formal specific form of warning. Tidak ada borang ataupun bentuk warning yang tertentu. What you have to do is that when you look at the judgment given by the court, the moment the court says that I'm warning myself, I bear in mind, I know that this is visual identification, I know that this is highly prejudicial, so I have to be cautioned. That is already warning. Ya, kita warn diri kita. Number 2, the second guideline is that there is a need for the judge to direct the jury or himself, to examine matters that reflect the strength or cogency of the evidence, This is what we talk about the quality assessment. Now, what does it mean is that the judge has to look for facts which reflective of strength or cogency. For example, during examination in chief, cross and re-examination, the prosecutor must already have a mission. Prosecutor, the mission is, okay, I must make sure that this person will reflect good quality of identification. So what happened here is that during examination in chief, cross and re-examination, dia akan tengok like factor, the time factor. How long have you observed? Was it the day, during the day, or was it the night? Was the lighting good? Are you near or far? Are you face to face or not with the accused person? These are all examples of factors that may reflect quality of identification. So the third one will be the judge may convict, right? The judge may convict based on identification evidence, based on visual identification evidence, if the quality is good. So what does it mean is that, if you have a trial here, the court is assessing the quality. So if the quality is good, so the visual identification evidence is relevant and admissible. If the quality is poor, the judge can say that the visual identification evidence is not relevant, not admissible. You got that? So that is where the court can convict. You do not have any other evidence, you only have visual identification evidence. The court says that, well, I can convict provided that the quality is good. And the fourth Turnbull guideline is the court can look at other evidence, other evidence as supporting evidence. Okay, this will be, for example, you have, right, if you were interviewed by the police will ask you, can you describe the person? So you bagi description. You bagi description, kata that person has a scar on his left cheek. His hair is curly, he is limping when he walks. What you did was actually you write down the description. This will be an evidence to support your subsequent identification later. Alright. Now, bear in mind, okay, this is basically all the 4 guidelines in Turnbull. The court, in the case of Ja'far bin Ali, basically applied the Turnbull guideline, which has been modified. Now, having said that, even though this is a Turnbull guideline that is largely applied by our court, there have been several subsequent decisions which says that, well, Turnbull guideline is a guideline and I don't want to follow the Turnbull guideline. So there are cases in Malaysia that they don't strictly apply the Turnbull guideline. So what happened? The case like Yazid Minhad, Yazid Minhad, you have the case of Arivesto. So these cases basically does not apply Turnbull guidelines strictly. Now, even though these cases does not apply Turnbull guidelines strictly, these cases has emphasized on the quality assessment, right? Quality assessment. And this case basically come to conclusion that if the quality is good, you can convict. If the quality is poor, you cannot rely on. So that is the situation. So basically, it apply the Turnbull guideline lah. Cuma dia tak pakai all the 4, Maybe that will be the situation. So you got the picture? Right. So now, so basically what you have here, when you have visual identification, you basically have procedural issue. Remember, procedural issue happens during investigation stage, and what you are looking at is actually the police officer in the conduct of identification parade, whether the police actually observe the procedure or not. Now, when you talk about issues in trial, you are looking at the court here deciding whether the evidence of identification should be accepted or not by looking at the quality of identification. So you have basically the Turnbull guideline. Yeah, this is on the assessment of quality. Now, to reflect, how does this work? Yeah, let me show you the case of. There are two cases which I want to explain to you. One will be the case of Ong Po Cheng. You contrast this with the case of Ja'far bin Ali. Now, what happened in the case of Ja'far bin Ali? Right. In the case of Ja'far bin Ali, you basically have the accused person. So the accused person here was watching this girl. So you have this girl who may be like 9 years old, yeah, or 10 years old. She was playing dekat tepi kedai tu, main teng-teng ke, right? And about 2:15 PM, dia punya bola teng-teng tu, yang umpan teng-teng tu jatuh dalam longkang. So basically, she can't play anymore. So what happened here? This man was observing her on a motorcycle. He was just watching her on the motorcycle. He was wearing a helmet, and his helmet has a visor. So basically, it covered the face. So what happened here? Now, remember this case happened in the 1980s. Yeah, you have very innocent child here who basically trust in people. What happened here after the fact that this girl cannot play anymore, this man approached her. So this man panggil budak ni, "Dek, come. Since you cannot play anymore, let's go on my motorcycle. We just go round and round the kampung." So this girl was so excited, follow the man on the motorcycle. So basically, dia duduk dekat belakang the pillion rider, yeah. So the man bring her round and round the kampung until maybe katakanlah about 7:30. He stopped by at a rubber plantation, right? And he was wearing a helmet. Remember, during that time, at the few minutes that they were together, this girl only see the back of that man, yeah? Dia tak nampak muka. Right? About 7:30 or so, he stopped at rubber plantation. So he looked at the girl still wearing the punya helmet and visor and show the girl some photographs. Right? Show the girl some photographs of women wearing bikini and whatnot. And later she come to her, barulah dia buka visor tu and strangle her. Ya, baru masa dia nak strangle tu is only the time when he opened up dia punya visor, and that is when the girl saw his face. And she screamed and she collapsed. She was unconscious. Right, she was unconscious. Now, when she screamed, someone who was at the rubber plantation heard her scream and ran towards her, and the man ran away. And she was actually brought to the hospital where she was unconscious, katakanlah for 2 or 3 days. Right? And upon her gaining consciousness, 2 police officers came to her and asked her what transpired. In their first meeting, she did not say anything. On the second meeting, the 2 police officers came to her again, and this time the police officers showed photo of the accused person. And then the next day, she was asked to go to the police station and have an identification parade where the accused person was in a line up. So what happened here is that the girl here positively identified the accused person at the identification parade. Yeah, maybe a year later, the matter goes for trial. The girl now is giving evidence in the court, and this particular girl is being cross-examined as to what transpired on that day. because the girl here is saying that she actually saw the man. So the girl mengaku dia positively identify the witness. If you look at these facts here. Now, the first one, whether the evidence of identification of the girl here of an accused person at the identification parade relevant and admissible or not. So that will be your one issue. So your first issue will be whether this identification of the accused person at the identification parade, relevant and admissible or not. Now, if you look at this situation, what do you think? I think you will find that the identification made by the girl here was maybe suffered from procedural flaw because she was shown the photograph of an accused person prior to identification parade. Now, you got to look at the rules on safeguard on identification parade. You are not supposed to show photograph because it's going to be highly prejudicial. The showing of photograph can tantamount to coaching or indirect instruction for you to identify the person at the identification parade. And in this context, I believe that the identification of the girl, by the girl of the accused person at the identification parade was so flawed. The flaw is fatal. So, here, it is not relevant, not admissible. The identification of the accused person by the girl at the identification parade suffers from procedural flaw, not relevant, not admissible. But remember the case of Dorai Pandian says that it doesn't matter because what is most important will be identification in the court. It is only supporting evidence. If you don't have it, sebenarnya not too bad. You still can have the second chance of identification in the court. So what will happen here? In the court will analyze whether the girl's identification here is of good quality or poor. Now, what do you think? I think the facts of the question here is, so number 2 punya issue ialah whether the girl's evidence of identification in the court of the accused person relevant and admissible or not. That will be your second issue. You will find that upon invoking Turnbull guideline, the quality will be poor. Why? Number 1, alright, she have very few minutes of observation. She did not actually see the person face to face. Now, the identification was made where the surrounding was dark. You look at this situation, it happens at the rubber tapper, 7:30 p.m. So the environment is going to be very dark, right? And then, and therefore, if you analyze the quality, the court come to a conclusion that the quality is also poor. So what will happen here in the case of Ja'far bin Ali? The girl's evidence of identification under Section 9 is not relevant, not admissible. So therefore, it is rejected. So this is what happened in the case of Ja'far bin Ali. Right? Now, what happened in the case of Ong Po Cheng? To illustrate a different point, let's look at the case of Ong Po Cheng. Now, in the case of Ong Po Cheng, you basically have the witnesses here. So this case happens at a jewelry shop. Jewelry shop. So you have the witnesses here. There are several witnesses here. Witness number 1 could be the shop, the salesman of the shop. You may have witness number 2, witness number 3, right? Witness number 2 could be the customer. Witness number 3 could also be the customer, right? So you have witness number 1 here who was observing the people coming and going of the shop. And he basically observed that there is one car parking right in front of the shop. 2 persons came and go into their shop. And he was entertaining here, A1 and A2. Right? Now, they were entertaining. Remember, you entertain orang nak beli cincin. So it has to be, okay. This one, when you entertain, so he was looking at this man face to face, look at the items, and then negotiating with this person, and suddenly this person withdrew guns and start committing robbery. So what happened here is that while A1 and A2 committed robbery, all the witnesses here managed to hide and press the button for police help. So the police came by while A1 and A2 committing robbery. So when the police came by, there was exchange of gunshots between the police and the accused persons. So they were running away, and one of the accused person, A2 here, is being shot by the police at the back, dekat punggung sebelah kiri dia. Right? And all these were observed by W1. Yeah? All these were observed by W1 in the shop. Yeah? Eventually, all the accused person were caught, and the next day, katakan 2 days later, all the witnesses here were brought to the police station to identify at the identification parade. Now, what happened here is that while waiting for the police to prepare the accused person and the false in a line-up, W1, W2, and W3 were all kept in one room where they had exchange of discussion. And eventually, all of them identified the accused 1 and accused 2 at the identification parade. Later, during trial, okay, now on this point, that point, the issue here is whether W1's evidence of visual identification of A1 and A2 here at the identification parade relevant and admissible or not. You got to look whether the procedure is proper or not. So here you find that all the witnesses are lumped together in one room. So you have this case, you have the procedure. Basically, there's going to be fatal flaw. Why is it fatal flaw? Because the moment you lump the accused persons, you lump the witnesses all in one group, they are going to have a hell of a discussion. Or they start to remember things, yeah? They start to recall things. Their memory may be the memory of the other person. So they have discussion, and this is resulted in the fatal flaw on the process of identification. So what happened here is that the identification of the witness here, even though it's a positive identification, it suffers from procedural flaw, and the procedural flaw is fatal. Conclusionnya ialah the evidence is not relevant, not admissible. Now, W1 here being called to give evidence in the court. Now, in this court, remember, the court has to analyze the quality of his identification. Now, in this case, the court was so impressed with evidence of W1 here and believed that he has good quality because W1 here is basically explaining the situation in great detail. Because W1 here has face-to-face encounter with the accused person, right? So dia nampak orang tu punya muka face-to-face. And remember, the lighting in the shop is good because it's a jewelry shop. It's not going to be very dim. So the lighting is good. So you have observation face-to-face. He also saw what transpired, the exchange of gunfire between the police and the accused person. And what impressed the court most is that W1 here even managed to identify out of these two accused persons which one that has been shot and which location he was shot at. So because of that, the court believed that W1 here has good quality identification, so his evidence of identification is relevant and admissible. You got that? So by these two examples, you will find that even though there may be flaw in the process of identification parade, but what is more important will be identification in the court, and the evidence of identification may be relevant and admissible if it is of good quality. Okay? Now, okay, to wrap up, so basically we have looked at visual identification. These are all the questions that we have addressed just now on visual identification. So this will be the procedural issue that we also have discussed earlier. And right, so this will be the outcome of identification parade. Remember, what you got to do is that you have to analyze